6 years ago, there was an album that was released that didn't get a review at the time, and it's one that sorely needed one. So right before we depart for good, I do want to sort of close that link and give this album the review that it needed 6 years ago, but is now going to receive in 2019. Spiritual Migration by Persefone is an interesting album for many different reasons. For one, this is a product from Andorra, which is not a country that you traditionally associate very much with music. In fact, there's probably a lot of folks that don't even realize it's a country, think that it's a city. It's kind of unfair, but it's the unfortunate reality. It is a very small country. And this is really one of their biggest metal exports, especially in the current heavy metal scene. And this is a group that still, to some, is largely unknown, a name that means absolutely nothing. Well, we need to change that, especially considering this album gave a lot of good reason to scope out Persefone and make them part of your metal vernacular. And if this album didn't do it, Athma from 4 years later in 2017 should have done that. But why? Why should we care? That's the reason why I'm here. The reason why you should care is because of the myriad of different influences that we got off of Spiritual Migration, not to mention the actual story or concept behind this album as a whole is also incredibly unique. It might not be one that necessarily blows your socks off, it might seem a little highbrow, but the idea of this being almost like the track of an actual meditative state in order to try to become more one with the universe is kind of cool. It reminds me a bit of Modeling of the Well. But the music itself reminds me more of Opeth or Baroness/Mastodon. There's death metal stylings, progressive music is everywhere in this. They have a combined, very hybrid style approach that is extremely accessible despite the fact that it sounds like there's a lot going on. And that's what I think makes Spiritual Migration a great pick if you're trying to dive into Persefone for the very first time. It's a very accessible album, while at the same time, a very beautiful one. And it starts off, innocently enough, with Flying Sea Dragons, which is a less than 2-minute long introduction that takes you into Mind as Universe. Now you're going to notice with some of these song titles, the story that's sort of being unveiled right before your eyes, or the concept that's being unveiled right before your eyes. And your ears are feeling very much attuned to this also, considering the riffing that you're getting on these initial couple of tracks, which is also including The Great Reality, the first 6-minute plus song on this album, There Will Be More, is one that really is keeping you very attuned. The death metal growls that you get on this album are very solid and crisp and feel like they don't overstay their welcome or present themselves in a wrong place. This is one that has been very expertly tuned to ensure that it has a great feeling behind it. Nothing here feels like it's being forced, and as a result, despite the fact this album is 70 minutes, the time kind of flies by. You get very surprised whenever you're at a certain point of the disc. You think that you've actually only been listening to the first couple of songs, but it's almost over. And that is really true whenever you get into the heart of this disc. Whenever you get into songs such as Consciousness 1 and 2, which is a two-part duality that this album is able to impress upon us, both of which being 5 minutes in length by themselves. These two ideas could easily run together and have been one gigantic 10-minute monster, but they are unique enough where I like the idea of them being split up. They do have two different sides and feel like they have a lot to offer individually. Going into Inner Fullness, which now we're into near 8-minute long territory, this is an album that expands so very much in its second act that it's definitely very attuned and keeps very, kind of kosher with the idea of, a spiritual migration. It is very attuned with the idea of expanding your mind, trying to become one with the universe, meditation, and deeper principles such as that. And you even get that with something such as meta meditation, which goes into upward explosion and then into the title track itself. Looking at these songs individually, you can see the transition. You can see the way in which we're going from point A to point B. But then musically speaking, this is also the part of the album that expands out even greater, where we start to hear some more, repetitive melody. Either that or a lot more softness that's interwoven. Either that or we get the impression of some keyboards coming in order to provide an extra additional layer of, just adding another layer to this meditative state. It's the reason why this works so well is whenever you take on something like this, or whenever you have a dream, it's not something that just remains very static. It's not something that's just you walking, down a street and nothing around you really moving or changing. Usually dreams or meditative states, if they are achieved properly, are exceptionally vibrant. There's a lot of color, there's a lot of kinesis, there's a ton of motion. Nothing just stays the same. And as a result of this, this album doesn't stay the same. It continues to have kinesis. It continues to showcase motion. And the music is able to adequately catalog this journey in a way that feels very realistic, but at the same time, extremely relaxing. There's a lot here that you can just sit back and enjoy and almost meditate to. It does sort of have that dual effect. You might say, but you said the word death metal, and death metal growls. That doesn't sound very relaxing. That doesn't sound very calming. Give this album a try, and I think you'll understand more so what I mean. The approach that it's been given definitely gives it a bigger and better feeling. But then you get into spiritual migration and returning to the source. Now, if I have any complaint about this album, it's the fact that there is a repetitive hook at the end of Returning to the Source that I feel like goes on for a bit too long. But then I stopped and thought about it for a minute. I stopped and thought about everything that I just told you. And it's the fact that now we're coming down. We're returning to our source body. We're exiting the meditative heavens. We have finished our spiritual migration. We are now coming back to who we are, to our baseline. And as a result of doing that, it is going to require some of that. The same way in which you need some repetition, you need a mantra in order to get yourself into the designed state to enter into a meditative trance, or the same way that you could potentially allow yourself to lucid dream, or sometimes even force it, you need to also have something that's going to get you out of it, something that's not going to just snatch you away in an extremely anxiety-driven case or situation. And this is a very nice representation of that. They really did their homework whenever it comes to this. And as a result, it gives us an album that feels incredibly complete, where the outro feels just as important, even though we have already come to and come out of our journey. Musically speaking, this just dances everywhere in all different directions. All of these different songs are able to provide a unique experience, and that's what makes this tie together so very nicely, because whenever you explore it from a musical theme standpoint, either that or just look at it from an instrumental standpoint, everything does feel like it's very well contained, but at the same time, each song feels individual, feels unique, like you have yourself something to really brag about with each one of these tracks. I like that, considering it's an album that never feels like it's getting too dull or too boring. In 70 minutes, a lot of things can happen. You can feel very hot on something whenever it first starts off, but by the time you reach its conclusion, you're already getting tired of it and are just hoping for it to be over. Spiritual Migration doesn't paint that picture. It instead continues to add detail and add little things, so whenever you actually view this portrait, it's one that just blows your mind. It's one that has so many little nuances about it that you want to stand or sit and study it for hours at a time. That's what makes this album potentially one of the top 50 of the 2010s, or maybe even in the top 25. This is a disc that's easy to return to. It's one that has a grand amount of replayability. You're always going to find something a little bit new with it. Not to mention its musical presentation is second to none. This is the album that truly put Persefone on the map. Those who knew this band prior knew what they were capable about, but also marveled at this, marveling at the growth and the maturity that the band was able to show with such a diverse and, somewhat complex concept, taking it and making it very approachable from both a musical and a conceptual standpoint. What also gives this album a lot of props is just the execution. The execution of this is so well done, and the way in which they laid this out is wonderful. I always talk about concept albums, or albums in general, being like a flowing stream. It's something where you want to make it to point A to point B. Sure, there are going to be some twists and turns, but you don't want to have any deep ravines. You don't want to have floodplains that's going to deviate you off to one side or the other. This one takes you on the journey, and the river doesn't deviate. It doesn't split off. It doesn't get affected by a beaver dam or silt. It's instead one that is able to reach its logical end zone. I like this album for that reason. In fact, I really have grown to love this album over the past couple of years, and not reviewing it back in 2013 is a sincere regret, though whenever I think about that year, A lot going on. This is not going to get a score, but you may see this album once again in a list that we discuss here in about a week or so. So I wanted to touch base with this disc, not to mention give a shout out to Evil Toad for recommending that we take care of this, considering I was speaking to him about decade lists. And this is an album that certainly feels qualified. Will it make it? You'll have to stick around to find out. But if I were to give you one final recommendation, if I were to give you one final band that perhaps you didn't know prior to clicking on this video or clicking on this channel, I would scope out Persefone. I think they're a band that for many of you out there, you're going to enjoy, mainly because it doesn't stay focused with just one sound and instead expands outward. And it definitely feels like whenever we see some of the biggest albums of 2019, for example, this was ahead of its time. But I want to know what you think about Spiritual Migration, whether you've heard it before or whether you're just now hearing it for the first time. Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for putting up with my random banter over 11 years. I'll miss all of you. I really will. We have a couple of videos left. I hope that you'll stick around for that. If you're new, please still subscribe. That way you can see those videos before everything goes down. I'm CoverKillerNation, and I'll talk to you next time. Take care.